Well, thank you. I want to give you a little bit of context for my understanding of context on the internet. So I've been programming the internet for a long time, since I guess about 1995. And I was thinking about one of the first moments where I began to experience the sort of full mystery of what this internet thing is. And it was when I was building out the website for Byte magazine, and we had a third-party service relationship. So somebody was providing some kind of registration service for my website, and it was delivered through an HTML form. And I had a couple back and forth rounds with the guy that was developing this thing for me, because he basically had the form up on his website and he had the service hosted on his website, but I kept having to make some changes in the form. And I finally, one day I said to him, why don't you just send me the form and I'll host it on my website, right? And I'll just point to the service on your website, and then we can decouple these things and both work independently. And we both said, will that work, right? And we was like, it should, right? I mean, the form has this thing that says action equals, and it points to this URL. Nothing says that the server that hosts the form has to be the same server that hosts the service. I think we can pull these things apart, and it should just work, right? And it was just one of those moments which keeps on happening and happening and happening to us even to this day, where you're just kind of surprised about what the properties of the internet are, right? This kind of loosely connected system is pretty magical. But it was also, looking back, it just encapsulates a lot of the mystery about where context is, who creates it, and what it is, right? So in this case, how would you define what the context was there? Well, there was a server that was hosting a service. There was my server that was dishing up the form that was connecting to that service. But in a way, the browser was kind of integral to this too, right? Because it really was in the browser that the connection was being made between the form and the service that the form points to. Maybe about another year later, I did my first mashup. And this was a deal where I was working for, so Byte belonged to McGraw-Hill. McGraw-Hill had a bunch of web properties, and they got the idea it would be good to be able to search across all the McGraw-Hill magazines. So they had the idea that they had to suck all the information into one big database and then index that and make it searchable. And I was thinking, well, I think there's a more internet-like way to do that. And the dominant search engine at the time was Alta Vista. And like now, you could do a search that said the equivalent of site : So I realized I could search, the Aviation Week website and the Byte website. I could search, half a dozen McGraw-Hill properties through Alta Vista, and then I could bring the results together and merge them and basically create a McGraw-Hill branded search engine, just leveraging this kind of connectedness of the internet. And that was another one of these things about, well, what's a client? What's a server? What's a service? In this example, the browsers in that era weren't actually able to do the mashup like we would be able to do now. So in that case, I had to materialize the service in the cloud. So I put a service up there that would, receive a request for the query, send it off to Alta Vista times the number of things that were being searched, bring them back together and display it in the browser. Nowadays, we have the option to do that in the browser, right? So it can be done client side. It can be done in either place. And that's, kind of part of what I'm observing here is that, context is a pretty fluid thing, right? And it isn't just about what's on the client, what's on the server, what's in the cloud, right? It's an interaction among these ingredients. So, and it's kind of, in a way, a negotiation amongst a number of different parties. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is when the interests of those parties either are or are not in alignment with one another, right? Because you can have friendly or not so friendly context negotiations going on in the web. And we'll talk about some examples of both of those things. We call the browser a user agent, which is an interesting term. But I think that more and more the things that I think of as my agents aren't going to be things that are tightly coupled to my browser or to my device, right? I want to think about the agency that's happening on my behalf as itself a kind of a service that lives in the network and is distributed, in fact. In 1995, we did a big cover story in Byte magazine. Does anybody remember a company called General Magic and an operating system called Magic Cap and a programming language called Telescript, right? So the idea was distributed agency, right? You would have these agents, these software agents, and they would be negotiating with other agents on your behalf. And these agents, they were kind of mobile, right? I mean, they could hop onto your device, they could hop up into the cloud. They were associated with you. They weren't associated with a particular device or technology or location, right? And I think that's just kind of worth keeping in mind because we're still not quite there yet, but I feel like we're getting there. So, now we're only in maybe 1997, so a long time ago, and that was a year where I saw the emergence of a whole bunch of what I look back on now as context-enabling technologies. And the amazing thing is that they all happened in Internet Explorer, wait for it, 4, IE4, right? Had a cluster of things in it that were so amazing to me because I thought that all this stuff was going to be right around the corner. So, 4 things, right, in honor of the version number. Number 1, if anybody remembers, there was a thing called Active Desktop, and Active Desktop was the precursor to RSS, right? And in fact, the format underneath of it was called CDF, which was Channel Definition Format, which was an RSS-like newsfeed syntax, and Active Desktop was a thing that was basically the first RSS reader, right? So, in 1997 in IE4, you had this notion of, already, kind of personalized news feeds assembling stuff for you on your desktop. There was this thing called dynamic HTML, which kind of simmered on the back burner for about 10 years and then exploded as, Ajax. It got a brand name and suddenly was interesting, but it had been there way back then. And CSS, which I think is really interesting. I mean, who actually thinks about what cascading style sheets means, right? What was the cascade? The cascade was from the site's style sheet down to your style sheet, the idea being there would be or could be user style sheets that would override and personalize the stuff that the site was showing you, right? Well, that didn't actually happen, right? Who actually overrides a site style sheet with a user style sheet? I don't think that ever happens. So there's kind of a lesson there about, I think, inertia and defaults, which is that, one of the things from a Kynetx perspective that's worth keeping in mind is that people will say that they want to have things their way, and they will make it sound like they care a lot about personalization, but if you watch what people do, they will almost always take the defaults too, right? And they'll settle for what they get, and they won't be very proactive about tuning their environment. So that's something to observe. And finally, digital identity, right? And this just kills me. I mean, it was 1997, and IE4 had this thing called client certificates. And I thought that this was great. I've got my digital wallet now, and I've got these IDs in it. And, we'd had, since really the dawn of the web and the birth of e-commerce, we'd had the server certificates that went along with the SSL handshake, right? So you had the case where when you went to a secure server, it was strongly identifying itself to you. Or in theory it was. In practice, you had no idea what that meant. People still have no idea what that means. But it was happening, right? The server was strongly identifying itself to you. And the inverse wasn't happening, and it still isn't happening, right? So, I'm thinking, this is great, right? It's like, by next year, no more of this name password stuff, right? I'm going to have, my wallet, and it's going to have these digital IDs in it, and the sites are going to know which ones to ask for, and life's going to be great. And we're still waiting for that to happen. So, this stuff, some of this stuff, it seems like it happens quickly, and then you look and realize it actually is on a fairly long cycle. And this is one of them. I basically am just hoping I live to see at this point. Right, so we sort of went into the internet boom, and we were missing a couple of key context-enabling things, right? Number one, if you wanted to ask the internet to present it to itself to you in a different way, there was no way to say that, right? There's no way to say, here's how I want it to look to me. And there was no way, even if you could do that, that it would know who you were,